Welcome to People in Profit, your essential business briefing. Coming up, have we avoided a trade war between the United States and China? Or is the agreement between Beijing and Washington just a temporary truce? Could Italy's next government plunge the eurozone into another crisis? We take a look at the country's debt problem. And we've a special report from Vietnam, where small family businesses are cashing in thanks to e-commerce. First up, back from the brink of a trade war. The United States has reached what it's calling a framework agreement with China to cut the trade deficit between the world's two largest economies. Washington and Beijing had been ramping up the rhetoric on a trade dispute for months. They're now set to continue talks over the summer towards a solution. So can the global economy breathe a sigh of relief? Speaking last Monday, the US Treasury Secretary said there were still many details to be worked out.
Again, there was a reason why we didn't put a specific number, and I would also say the specific number, again, whatever we agree to, these are not government-to-government purchases. We have very specific targets, industry by industry. These now have to be executed upon.
Well, for more on this, let's speak to Simon French, Chief Economist at Panmure Gordon in London. Simon, is this a moment we can all breathe a sigh of relief? Have we avoided a trade war, do you think?
Oh, I'm not convinced that now is the moment to celebrate the end of this. My personal view is this will run all the way to the US midterms. I think a lot of the White House agenda is driven out of what is electorally very popular with the Trump base. And so the date for your diary really to look for a potential end of this is November this year, when Trump goes back to the polls for midterms.
I mean, what have we learned from this whole experience? We had both sides get very close to something very serious. Was it always just political showmanship, do you think?
Well, look, when a disagreement of this scale, and we're talking about the two biggest economies in the world, come head-to-head, there is no obvious victor out of this. It isn't a mismatch, and actually a lot of it is rhetorical, trying to appear particularly credible in your threats for tariffs and non-tariff barriers in order to withdraw concessions. The challenge for people behind the scenes, and this is not Premier Xi or Donald Trump, this is the officials working behind the scenes, is to try and ensure that a settlement is reached where both those leaders, who are strong on their rhetoric, are talking to their domestic audiences, can claim some successes.
How do you see this all working out then? Are we going to end up with a situation not vastly different from what we have now, or do you think there will be big changes that will be agreed between the two sides?
Well, look, I'm fairly sanguine about this for the reason that we've got two economic areas very well balanced in terms of economic might. You also have a situation where there are big interconnections of supply chains. So if you start addressing a market, be it a telecoms market, finance market, aluminium, steel, you start to establish, as you delve into the detail, that as much as you are doing on one side of the ledger in terms of supporting your domestic industry, you may well be causing problems for the other side, either the consumers or others in the supply chain. So I actually think once a bit of economic sanity returns, the status quo will look broadly like it did before this kicked off.
Are there any particular sectors you'll be watching to see the agreements that have come up? We know China's already said it's cutting its tariffs on imported cars, for example.
Yeah, I mean, cars gets a lot of attention, particularly in Europe, given the importance of the car export market and when there's a potential spillover from a US-China dispute into other parts. But the area I'm looking at, financial services, is absolutely symbolic as to whether the Trump agenda of trying to open up market access actually goes into areas the Chinese have been very reluctant to open up to foreign competition in the past, want to have quite a lot of state control, but is the big opportunity for what is a predominantly service-led economy with a comparative advantage in financial services. That will be a good test case.
And is Donald Trump, do you think, if anyone's going to be able to get the Chinese to open up financial services, will it be Donald Trump?
No. These things are never won, and my own experience of working in government here in the UK is these things are never done by the principals, the leaders. These are done by the officials working behind the scenes, going line by line through the various disputes, making the evidence case for a reduction in tariff barriers, or indeed maintaining them at the current levels and not getting escalation. So actually it's the skill of the negotiating teams rather than the principal who will determine whether we get a dial down in the rhetoric or an unfortunate ramping up.
I mean, what could trip this up at this stage? We've got, things have definitely calmed down, but are there any red flags you see coming that could be potential sticking points that could land us all back in trouble again?
Well, the beauty of this story is it's so multi-headed, and you look at some things that are unrelated to trade, like the situation with North Korea and the role that China has in that region, as potentially interconnected with the whole view of the White House as to whether the Chinese are a cooperative partner, and Premier Xi has had some very warm words said about him from Donald Trump in the past. Will that survive if other things outside the immediate trade negotiations start to go sour? And we've seen that in recent days, North Korea dialing back some of its more positive rhetoric. Will China and that trade negotiation get drawn in as sentiment starts to wane on whether the Chinese can be a supportive partner?
When we look more globally at the situation for trade and the global economy, has damage been done by this dispute already to other areas outside of the US or China?
Too early to say damage has been done. I don't think it has. I think there is some disappointing data across the world at the start of the year 2018, not least in the eurozone, but it's actually more broad than that. It's very easy to attribute that to the rhetoric around trade tariffs, access to markets, barriers to globalization. But in reality, there was a big expansion, particularly in the eurozone, that was above trend in 2017. And I think what we're seeing across the world is the fact that we're returning a bit more to the kind of trend level of growth in 2018, against some really difficult comps, given how good last year was.
OK, Simon French from Panmure Gordon in London, thank you very much for speaking to us. This is a story, of course, we will continue to watch. Next to the latest political upheaval in Italy. After 2 months of political deadlock, a Eurosceptic coalition has been formed between the Five Star Movement and the Anti-Immigration League Party. Their joint policy programme outlines drastic tax cuts, rolling back pension reforms and a monthly basic income. The next administration will also need to face Italy's financial realities as one of Europe's most indebted countries. Yuka Royer is here with more on this. Yuka.
Well, Stephen, compared to the size of its economy, Italy has the second largest debt burden in the eurozone after Greece, with its public debt now at almost 132% of GDP. That's twice the level of Germany's and more than double the target set by the European Union. But Italy is also the third largest economy in the eurozone, and its economic output is much bigger than Greece's. Italy accounts for 15% of the eurozone's GDP and almost a quarter of the bloc's debt. Perhaps then not surprising that it's such a big concern. So how has Italy come to this? Growth has long been sluggish. Italy's economy is still about 6% smaller than before the 2008 financial crisis. One big issue is high unemployment. At 11%, the jobless rate is the third highest in the EU. Its banking sector has a lot of troubles too, with as much as 15% of private loans gone bad, prompting the government to inject public money to shore up the sector. While Italy's debt level is still considered sustainable, economists have been warning structural reforms are needed to bring it down, but political instability has left little room for reforms. The new populist coalition has promised measures including tax cuts, a €780 minimum monthly income for the most needy, and a lower retirement age. The leaders say the stimulus measures will boost growth and therefore lead to a reduction of debt, but most economists think it's wishful thinking. Some estimate the proposals would cause Italy's debt to rise to more than 150% of GDP over the next 5 years, Stephen.
Yuka, thank you very much for that. Well, let's turn next to Vietnam, where the small family business is being revolutionised by e-commerce. Rising incomes and growing connectivity have helped to fuel rapid online expansion, with many Vietnamese companies now attracting investors from abroad. From Ho Chi Minh City, our correspondent Clovis Casali sent this report.
Small family-run businesses are common all around Vietnam. The children often take over when the time is right. Not Buc Duc Tien, who went into business alone.
Welcome to my shop. Let's take a tour. Here are the shoes designed for women, and there's sneakers for men.
He was still a student when he got into e-commerce. He bought at the market $100 worth of backpacks to sell on the internet. 3 years later, he has 38 employees.
E-commerce has had a big impact on my life and my business. With the profits, I managed to open this showroom store. It also completely changed my mindset. I know I need to always stay in touch with the technological trends and adapt to this dynamic environment.
Ho Chi Minh is Vietnam's economic hub, and foreign companies set up offices here to tap into markets like e-commerce. The government expects the online shopping industry to rise by more than 30% per year over the next decade. Key players Tiki, Shopee and Lazada all compete in this country with huge potential.
And more than 50% of the people are below 27 years old, and this young population is very connected. So in Vietnam, we have seen over the past 5 years a very big penetration of mobile, and now we estimate that maybe 70% of the population is having a smartphone and is connected to internet on a daily basis.
Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba bought Lazada and injected $2 billion in April for its Southeast Asia operations. Vietnam is a priority, with a strategy to strengthen the company's position and bank on the future, rather than make short-term profits.
Well, that's it from us for this week. If you'd like to get in touch with your thoughts on the stories that we've been covering, or those that we're not, you can find us on Facebook at France24 Business, or you can tweet me at NewStephen. Until next time, thanks for watching.
In France, May 1968 has become a symbol of young people and workers in revolt. But how are the events of May 68 viewed outside France? France 24 retraces the international impact of this historic opposition movement and the sometimes surprising hopes and fears it engendered for the world's youth and its leaders.
Reporters, presented by Mark Owen on France 24 and France24.com.